Hello, I'm Cathy Wylie, and it's my pleasure to talk to you about the history of professional learning and development in New Zealand over the last 30 years. What I want to talk about is how once upon a time in the 1970s, 1980s, it was called in-service training, and then it became professional development, and now we talk about it as professional learning and development. So are we talking about the same thing each time, or are we talking about something different? And in some ways we're talking about some things that have stayed right through. In other ways we're talking about something which has changed over that time. And it's changed because of what we know about good teaching and learning. It's changed because of the infrastructure that we have to support teachers, and it's changed because of the policy around what it was that people thought that teachers needed to know, needed to do, needed to understand. So I'm going to draw on the work I did for my book Vital Connections, which looked at the changes in education since the 1970s, particularly on our self-managing schools. And to understand what's happened in our education system, I needed to understand what thinking and support had gone in for teachers in schools to improve capability to meet the expectations that we have of teachers and learning. So I'll start with the 1970s, 1980s, and that's when we talk about in-service training. And you know, it has quite an old-fashioned ring to us now, in-service. You know, the idea that something that is a public service that you enter and you keep going through, and the word training, as if this is something about teaching a particular skill or how to do something, you know, like changing a particular machine. And so in-service training was how it was talked about. Now, in the 1970s, 1980s. A lot of this was left up to individual teachers. They could call on advisors. There were only 180 of these by 1983, and then they were cut back to 165. That's to cover the whole country. A survey found that teachers were calling, 80% of primary teachers were calling on advisors maybe twice a year. Now, that's interesting because the advisors they came in response very often to teachers. It was left up to individual teachers to decide what it was that they wanted to know. And the example I give in my book is of somebody who'd given up science in the fifth form and felt, you know, here she was having to teach primary science, no idea how to go about it, is able to call on an advisor who models a lesson, shows her what's possible, shows her how to link the curriculum and activities in the classroom. She and her children have a wonderful day. At the end of it, she feels confident and she's learnt a lot and her kids have really enjoyed it, and she's seen what good teaching and learning could look like. So the modelling aspect of that advisory service was particularly important, and it was one-on-one, and it was often left up to individual teachers. So you have a situation where it's not the whole school emphasis that we have now in professional learning and development. It's up to individual teachers. So the advisors were a key part of it, and they were, some subjects had their own national service, like physical education, and so they had their own framework, and they had their own training and an anchorage, if you like, for that curriculum, and sharing of what was working well across the country. Other aspects like English and maths, it's very interesting that reading, one of the most potent forms of professional development is ERIC, which is still fondly spoken about by teachers who are in that era, partly because of the novelty of it, that it was the first time that there was a national approach to professional learning, and it was in the form of films that teachers could look at in their own time. So we get this emphasis on knowledge that is going to be useful to you, you know, when you want to access it. And it showed how to teach reading strategies, and it was often the first time that many of these teachers had seen that, which is, you know, a bit of a worry when you think about it. But it was done in a way that you know, left up to individual teachers that aspect of volunteering. Yes, I'm ready for this. I want to use it. An important aspect, and it was very successful because again it had the modelling aspect to it. And then LARIC followed that, which is for teachers in the later years of primary school, and it built on ERIC. But what people had said in response to ERIC was one of the things that they would have liked was more discussion of what they were seeing, and more discussion afterwards about the techniques that they were going to use, the new strategies. And so what LARIC built in was questions around what people were saying, what were seeing, emphasising that it was really important for teachers in a school to be discussing it together. And it also, either an advisor would be present with these discussions, or there would be, one of the teachers would take the responsibility of working with advisors out of the school and then coming back in. So again, this principle of having a link to somebody outside the school, to a greater network of knowledge and ideas, and that too was very, very powerful. So in those in the 1970s, 1980s, you know, there was a lot that was there wasn't a national framework really for professional learning, in-service training. A lot of it was left up to individuals. That meant that quite a lot of what happened was unevenly distributed. The enthusiastic teachers would grab every opportunity they could. Others were, you know, if they didn't want to know, didn't want to change, there wasn't a huge impetus for them to do that. The other part of professional learning in this period that is worthy of note is the famed Lockdell courses, which brought together teachers, advisors, inspectors to work on new curriculum areas, think about what it was that teachers needed. And out of that would often come some things that would travel almost organically through advisors, inspectors, enthusiasts. So a great unevenness. And I had a former inspector tell me about the shortcomings of this period when he talked about you know, seeing opportunities wasted, that you know he would you know, the inspectorate and advisors could identify people that they thought would be promising champions of change, and these people would be invited on courses, and sometimes these courses ran for 6 weeks or so, you know, residential courses, unthinkable now of that kind at a national level. And he said we expected this person to go back into their school, back into their area, and take that learning and use it through the school, and it didn't happen. And that was one of the shortcomings, was that because it was so individualised and left up to individuals, and the schools weren't running as collectives, they were running with each teacher in their own classroom, it was much harder to get that professional learning back into the schools. So an era where there was some very interesting work going on, and you know, based on identified need, but an era which was quite, in some ways, quite haphazard about whether the learning that was needed got to where it was needed. So that's the 1970s, 1980s, and in 1983 the OECD examiners were here in New Zealand, gave a very comprehensive look at our education system, and one of the big points they made was that there was a lack of in-service training. They said we had a very sophisticated curriculum here in New Zealand, but we weren't matching it with the support that we were giving our teachers. So that is something that is there, you know, that has been there for quite a long time in New Zealand. You know, that we've got something that is quite demanding of teachers, and we haven't been giving them the support that they needed. So that's the 1970s, 1980s. And I want to briefly go on to the 1990s, because this is after Tomorrow's Schools comes in, and this is when the advisory services are given to the universities with the school support services under contract. Very lucky, in fact. There was quite a move to have schools, the money for professional development, as it was beginning to be termed, given straight to schools in their operation grant. No sense that you might need a good infrastructure for professional learning and development. So in the 1990s, the national support for professional development was largely linked to the introduction around the national curriculum framework. And you might remember these, each curriculum area, a statement came out every 2 years, and there would be a couple of days professional development associated with that. And the model was that maybe 1 or 2 people from a school would go to a day that, with advisors from the school support services, and they would be expected to go back and take that knowledge with them, the Cascade Model. And it was quite a relentless pressure of one area after the other. And it was at a time when schools were coming to grips with school self-management. It was a time when schools weren't necessarily, you know, they were grappling with how do we work more collectively. So there's an assumption that you can take the professional, you know, have individuals go out, bring it back, but if you don't have the structures or processes within a school to utilise that learning, it's very hard for it to make much of an inroad. And a lot of the learning was about what is this new thing, how do we do this? You know, a desire to get it right, and it wasn't necessarily about some of the deeper underpinnings of it or the pedagogy around it. And when I was writing the book, I spoke with an experienced principal who said to me, this is a principal who's done some really good work, and she said it took her 3 iterations of the curriculum cycle, 3 different curriculum areas, for her to really understand the conceptual underpinning of the curriculum framework and the changes that it would mean. So you have a professional learning that is intensely focused on a particular area, the Cascade Model, and making it very, very hard to really change practice in school. And so a lot of what happened in the 1990s with the curriculum is that people grafted things onto what they already knew rather than seeing it as the opportunity for change. And so that's the 1990s. We see it called now professional development. So we move away from in-service training. We get the idea that this is about learning. Quite a lot of schools also, because they have more responsibility now for professional development. They're told that some money for this has gone into their operational grants and that they can make decisions about this. It's not going to be left up to individual teachers or to advisors and inspectors. And so some of them start to say, well, there's going to be this much money for each teacher each year to decide how they're going to use. So you have quite things beginning to get quite fragmented in some ways, as in some schools, teachers thinking that professional development is about taking the money and doing something outside the school with it, of their own choosing sometimes. So you have quite a mixture of things. And with the school support services, they are competing with each other for contracts. And so there is less sharing of the knowledge of how to improve teaching and learning in areas. So it's quite a mucky period for professional development. In the 2000s, we have what I think of as being a very positive shift, because there was a realisation that we seemed to be treading water a lot of the time, and that the new curriculum wasn't really changing practice, and we weren't really grappling with a lot of the issues around teaching and learning and student achievement that were becoming apparent. We hadn't made much progress over the 1990s. And there was a big change to nationally developed professional learning. We think about the numeracy initiative, the LPDP, literacy professional development. There was assessment for learning. We have Te Kotahitanga. These big programs that are based on research about what it is, what effective teaching and learning, and we have the best evidence syntheses as well that people begin to draw on. So we have quite a lot of an emphasis placed on let's get a solid basis for the knowledge about good teaching and learning. Let's draw on that knowledge and get people together to work, professional development from school support services, from researchers, experienced teachers, policy people. Let's get them all together working on how we can provide a framework, a guidance framework that people can use, facilitators, and the word becomes used, facilitators, coaches, how they can work with schools. Much more of an emphasis on working with schools rather than individual teachers, and going into schools and working with them on their data. So data becomes a word that is often used. What is their evidence about how things are going? So there is much more of this, quite a change, a realisation that you can't just leave it up to individual consultants or advisors, that it's really important for them to have a solid base, that you must also be customising that to each school, but working within a common framework. So there's more emphasis on exemplars, on protocols, on actually having things that are written down that people can look at and refer to. And there's more emphasis on getting student feedback and feeding that in about teaching and learning. More emphasis on coming back to observation, which is one of the things that in our national surveys we had found that teachers said what they really missed was the opportunity to go and observe other people and to learn from that and discuss it. So what we get from over the last 10 years or so has been much more of an emphasis on whole school professional development than more of an emphasis on professional learning. The idea that learning is part of teaching, that it isn't just a matter of simply training in how to implement something. It is about an attitude of standing back and thinking about what it is that you are doing in your teaching, what it is that students are learning. Is it what you intended? How is it that the students' results are related to what you have been trying to do, and discussing that with other teachers. So moving away from the isolation of the classroom teacher or the teacher working alone with somebody from outside the school. And the boundaries, I think, between schools and those who work with them outside the schools in professional learning and development have become more porous, more fluid. There's more of an emphasis now on, if possible, longer-term partnerships. So, it's no longer the single-day workshop, the Cascade Model. It is about schools wanting to work with people who know them and their context and their students and their teachers, wanting, if possible, to work with them over time, not necessarily intensively, but wanting to come back to the same people, more of a sense of partnership. And at the same time, if it's centrally funded, there is often time limits on what can be done. So, and there are some of these the frameworks within which people are working. There's always this tension between that framework and what it is that the school wants to focus on, and the evidence that it has around it to work with it. So there have been quite, that really is a sort of brief overview of the changes we see from, in-service training through to professional development, which starts to sort of see ongoing learning as part of being a professional, but still about implementation in the 1990s. And now we're getting at the sense that to be a professional, there is going to be ongoing learning, and we're seeing that in the context of not just me as a single teacher, but me in this context in my school. I think we have seen considerable gains in our learning about professional learning and development over this period, how to do it better with teachers and schools, and how to try and make sure that it is part of what schools feel they must do. So we're no longer leaving it up to individual teachers, and we're no longer leaving it up to chance. So there's a much more focus on it, and it's seen as a powerful engine to improve learning. So, and I think we've got much better knowledge about how to work with teachers so that they do gain new understanding, new skills that they can put into practice themselves. And I think about the change a little bit as being, you know, in development people talk about the difference between giving somebody a fish and teaching them how to fish. And I think one of the big changes for us in our profession, in our approach to professional learning has been like that. It's been about the difference between giving people in a school knowledge from outside as opposed to teaching them how to create that knowledge themselves and to have that vantage where they are always thinking about what they are doing and how they are doing it, and to have that more analytical, evaluative framework. I hope that the readings that go with this talk and the discussion that you have with those readings are useful and illuminating. And if you have further questions or thoughts you would like to share with me, please feel free to email me, cathy.wylie@nzcer.org.nz. And all the best.